Okay, hi everybody. My name is George Oates, and I'm, I think, the newest member of the British Library Labs Advisory Board. And Mahendra originally asked me to give a lecture this afternoon, and I said, how about we have a panel instead, because we can have a conversation. And that's what we're doing. So let me introduce my panellists. This is Jenn Phillips-Bacher from the Wellcome Library, Paul Downey from the Government Digital Service, and Mia Ridge, a newly minted British Library staffer. So I'm hoping today can be quite informal in a conversation. I'm going to ask some probing questions of each of my panellists to get the conversation rolling. And I hope that our chat asks some questions of you as well. And during the course of the conversation, if there's a question you'd like to ask, you can pop your hand up, or so we sort of plan to talk for about half an hour. But if there's a question that comes up in the meantime, please ask. Otherwise, there'll be time at the end reserved for questions. So the title of the panel is called The Ups and Downs of Open. And as a BL Advisory Board member, I'm looking for ways to help the BL share its stuff, because that's basically the premise and the purpose of the Labs project. And part of my work at my company is about cracking open big old cultural data sets and sharing them in a fairly radical way. And that's actually some work that I've done with Jenn at the Wellcome Library, which I'm hoping she can talk a little bit about too. But I think for me, the first steps of that process often fall down on metadata and how available metadata is and how easily consumable it is. We heard from Quasimodo before about his amazing work working with, I guess, the Flickr API, maybe a little more than BL APIs, but getting to the metadata is sort of the first step towards exposing content. I think a lot of makers out there in the world are now sort of presuming that things are open, and if they're not, there's some real disappointment there or sort of surprise. I think that's kind of an interesting change over the last sort of 8 to 10 years, where the assumption is that things are available, and it's a surprise when they're not. So I think that's also an interesting point and can be quite confronting sometimes. But as Dina, the bow tie maker, said to us before, I hope this is a down-to-earth presentation, even though we're all clever and intelligent. I want this to be a chat about sort of first-person stories from each of these experts about what it's like to try and share their stuff. So we'll start with Jenn. Jenn and I and the Wellcome team, who are all sitting up the back with pom-poms and stuff. But Jenn and the team and I and my team did a really great project called What's in the Library just this year. It was sort of in July and August. And you can find out more about it at what'sinthelibrary.com, and where we heavily documented our work, actually. But when Jenn came to me first to get the work started, one of the prime drivers of this concept was called Show the Thing. And Jenn, I just kind of wanted to hear a little bit about how Show the Thing came about for you.
Sure. Well, I don't know how many of you know much about Wellcome Library, but we've been actually putting stuff out into the open for over 10 years now. We've got a picture library called Welcome Images, and 100,000 of those historical images have recently been uploaded into Wikimedia Commons. They're CC BY. Anyone can use them for anything. So we have a history of being open with our content. But we're also in the middle of a really massive digitization program. And while we've had this picture library with, I suppose, mostly the treasures of the Wellcome, we've been digitizing and digitizing and digitizing. We've got several pretty big initiatives on at the moment. The biggest is the UK Medical Heritage Library project with JISC and the Internet Archive. And we are digitizing our 19th century collections and drawing in the content from 9 other partner institutions. There's absolutely no way that staff can keep up with the amount of stuff that's coming through. We genuinely don't know what's there. We've got an RSS feed. I think the RSS feed has about 4 followers. So that's really the only way to know what's coming through. There are a few individuals who have access to dashboards who can tell us some things, but There's no way to know, and there's actually no good way of showing all of the images. So while we've got this best of picture library over here, we've got 13 million images sitting in our digital repository. So I wanted to work out with George how we could build something that people could interact with that something that didn't include a search box. Because if you don't know what's there, why would you even think to type in a search term? So that's where I brought in George and Frankie Roberto to help develop a way to see inside our collections.
Mm-hmm. And that was kind of fun for us because I know a little bit about MARC, this sort of infamous library metadata format, but Frankie and Tom didn't know very much about it, and I wanted to keep it that way because MARC's really weird.
Yeah.
And it's really arcane if you don't know it, And so that was a real sort of, speaking as a consumer of the metadata that Jenn and the team provided, I sort of counselled Frankie and Tom to remain, to keep it completely abstract. And that sort of led to some really interesting explorations, sort of visualizations of the sort of, I guess, completeness of the metadata was one of the theories that we were working with. Can we en masse kind of illustrate the density or the heft of this metadata, and that was kind of interesting. What did you guys think in the aftermath of that sort of approach?
Well, one of the interesting things about the project, apart from it being about an attempt to show the thing, was to actually expose what's inside our databases to staff, and every week we did a demo of what had been built the week before, and catalogers were coming to these presentations every week, and I think they were a bit, I guess they were surprised by what they saw, because right now we're in a situation where we've got this black box library management system where catalogers can put data into. They can run a report and get data out, but there's no really easy way to make corrections en masse in the system. So when we took it out of the library management system, all 962,000 MARC records, and we're able to visualize that, I think the catalogers felt a bit exposed, I suppose is the best way of putting it. What we found is that there's a long and storied history from cataloger to cataloger, co-opting certain free text fields for purposes.
Nefarious purposes? Yeah.
I think well-intentioned purposes, but a lot of times that knowledge didn't make its way through into a new cataloger. So we were working with with Branwen, who's the metadata coordinator, and she can rattle off all of the MARC fields and tell you what they're for. And a few of them, she would just say, I think Paul may have used that, but I've been here 10 years and we haven't used it since.
Yep. But let's keep it anyway.
Because it's an
identifier.
Because it might be useful to someone, somewhere, at some point in the future. So one of the interesting things that I'm currently in discussion with the cataloging team about is how we can actually maybe build some kind of middleware, build them a nice dashboard, something that ties into the visualizations that were built as part of what's in the library, and actually helps them dig into the metadata and make the corrections that they feel they need to make before we release it to other people who want to work with it. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. Part of me thinks, let's just release it like this and see what happens. But they very strongly feel that it is their role to provide that bit of authority, and we would be remiss in not taking that opportunity to do a bit of cleanup, I think.
That's a nice segue, actually. So speaking of authority, Paul works at the Government Digital Service, and I've invited him here primarily because he's not in cultural heritage land specifically, but I think a lot of the work that he's been doing at GDS, sort of as a satellite architect who goes into various sort of departments at the government, is actually kind of similar to the questions that librarians and other cataloguers ask of their data. So Paul, could you just explain a bit about the work that you do at GDS?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in GDS for about 4 years now, and GDS, I don't know if you know, is part of the Cabinet Office, and it was set up in response to a letter from Arthur Lane Fox, who was then the digital champion, to Francis Maud, who was the Minister for the Cabinet Office. And it was written actually by a bunch of people who were being, inside and outside government, who've been calling for a revolution, not an evolution in government IT, as they call it. And so she came up with 4 proposals, and the first one was to fix, to create somebody who's in charge of IT, and that was us, that was Government Digital Service. Then we were going to fix publishing. So government had like thousands of different websites on different domains, and you had to understand government to find things. And so, some very high user needs, like what to do when somebody dies, or how to get a horse passport or whatever. You had to understand where to go to find that.
That's a high user need for me, actually. I care a lot about that.
There's about 10,000 people a day look for that. So, we put that onto a single website. It's sort of, by and large, been successful in that we've answered mainstream needs really well. We won Design Museum Design of the Year in the same year as the Heatherwick Cauldron and the Shard. It's great. But I think we've gotten to the stage now where there's a long tail of specialist needs, and we're starting to work with departments to improve that, but it's not been straightforward. It's much harder than you think. And then the next stage was services. So there's lots of transactions between you and government, and again they're all over the place. And there's lots of signposting we've added. Start page on gov.uk, but then quite often you drop off a cliff. You're in sort of old, 1980s or 1990s world when you come and do stuff. And so we've worked with departments to try and improve those services. We picked 25. We had a go at those. It's really hard. One of those was Land Registry, which is where I was working. I'll talk about that in a second. And then the final thing is Go Wholesale, which is where we get to the open stuff, the value of open. So we can make, it shouldn't just be Land Registry. It'd be nice to go to, I don't know, Zoopla or your estate agents, and them to be able to build you a beautiful sort of concierge service for moving house that joined up all the bits of government. But it'd be quite hard to do that now. You'd have to understand a lot of things and change you have to fill in a lot of paper or paper that's on the web. So we picked 25 things, or the government picked 25 things collectively, and one of those things I worked on several things, but the one that stuck in my mind most and I learnt most from was Land Registry, which is a 150-year-old institution. If you put a list of all the chief land registrars in a row, you're going to see a lot of public school boys, and you can tell when the world wars are because the public school boys are wearing uniform. And, it's just culturally, it's an establishment. And that's good because the job they have is really, really important. It's like, basically, it's an authoritative list of who owns what in the country. And it's the reason why you don't have to have an army, to protect your property. You can trust Land Registry's records. And, other countries which, like Honduras is looking to blockchain at the moment because they've got this problem where, there's lots of mendacity around ownership of property. So having an institution who stands behind that is great. But going to try and change a 150-year-old institution was really hard. A 30-year-old mainframe, and so I had sorry, I'm rambling a bit.
No, I don't mind.
It's fine. So basically, to cut the quick, I had the brilliant, that fortunate thing which you can come in as an outsider. When you're in a domain and you're really deep in that domain, like property ownership, you can start asking some really basic questions like, well, I read that we're 68th in the world when it comes to transacting on property. Why is that? Why does it take so long? Why do I have to have a solicitor to move house? And these are questions which are really challenging for people who's got a day job and don't really think about the bigger picture. So it's a real privilege to go and do that, and I hope I didn't annoy them too much by asking silly questions. But the outcome was we built a concept, like this is what a land registry should look like, under the current legislation. And their board really liked it, and now they're going through a transformation as a result of that. but it was really working with them that led to that prototyping, and it was great.
Paul wrote a recent blog post on the GDS blog about registers and how they can be designed well for sort of clear and explicit use.
Yeah.
And one of the concepts that you introduced in that blog post is one that I've sort of come at from a library land point of view, which is a sort of this idea of a minimum viable data set, where, I mean, well, in my world, that I would call it a minimum viable record for a book, because I used to work with library metadata at the Internet Archive, and we were dealing with a catalogue that had 30 million records in it, probably about a third of which was some kind of duplicate, So we spent a lot of time thinking about how to blend records together and all that sort of thing. And that was where the idea of this sort of minimum viable record for a book came up, where really it's just an array of identifiers that point to each other, and that's all it needs to do. And it sounded like the minimum viable data set was something a bit similar to that.
Yeah, I mean, so Land Registry, they have a geological time frame, 150 years is a long time, and they've seen a lot of departments come and go. So it's hard for them to trust somebody else to be the authoritative source for the data and link to that data. So, for example, like addresses, they actually have addresses in Land Registry titles rather than trusting a register of addresses, from Ordnance Survey or whoever. And similarly, there's lots of stories to tell around that kind of trust that's needed between data sets for that to work. There's one data set with 3.5 million records in it and an address. And there are 12 spellings of Scotland in the country field. Yeah, because there's a culture of people filling in forms, and then people, not. So there is a culture of paper which is being put onto the web, and quite often things which you think would be drop downs are text fields. So country is a text field, and then when you speak to people, you either get lawyers will tell you, oh, we have to do that because law says it. So then you say. Then it took me a while to have the nerve to say to a lawyer, can you show me where it says that? Because I'm pretty sure it doesn't. And then, you go to legislation.gov and then they come back and say, oh, yeah, it's fine, you can put a drop down. But, say Company's House has got, a country of origin field for a company, for that to trust a drop down from somewhere else, it's got to trust that other organisation. Just so happens that the organisation probably best suited is Foreign Office, but even within government, you might say, okay, well, isn't it Ministry of Defence or Home Office who's got the best immigration, or they've got real reasons to have those lists. And you go to gov.uk, there's 10 or 12 lists of countries which are all authoritative. Pick one.
Does this sound familiar, anyone?
And sometimes each of those things so there's a list of countries which is like where you've arrived from, or you were born in, or your company's registered, and that you feel like, okay, that's going to be, an ISO code, right? And then then you get into really difficult things like names for things, which are kind of, you've got antonyms and synonyms and all those magical things. But ultimately, you want a two-letter code, an ISO code to put in there. Even that's difficult because people will say to you, but the ISO 3166-2 code's got Palestine and Taiwan in it, and we don't recognise Palestine, or maybe we do, I don't know, I'm not sure. And then so well, surely the government's got a position on that. It turns out it does. On gov.uk it says, ISO 3166-2, and Palestine is the Israeli-occupied territories, and Taiwan is part of China. That's the government's official position. It's may or may not be mine, but it's a position. So as soon as you do that, then you can build a drop-down. Right, but it's just getting, and it's really basic, boring stuff. And yet, when you go to the top of the shop, it's news to a minister that there's 12 spellings of Scotland in this data set. So,
well, apart from the minister at the top, through my glasses, I would actually see these two situations as sort of similar. Like Jenn, you're also dealing with a variety of siloed data sets and a variety of sort of standards to take account of, and authoritative sources and such. It's sort of.
The trick is finding those stories. So no, we've told those stories now, and people go, "Oh, now I get it." But for years, people didn't get it. They say, "What's the problem?" Well, so I remember going to somebody quite senior a few years ago and saying, "There's 12 spellings of Scotland," and the answer was, "So what?" And it was like a real sort of foot the stairs moment that was walked out. you can't do anything without that. But, you know, at that point I was intimidated by people, you know, and less intimidated now.
Good. Okay, great. Well, on that happy note, Mia, I've asked you to be on the panel today because you've just started a new job, and you've also got a really long and great history in examining other people's data sets and poking around in them and assessing them. And I thought it might be interesting for the crowd to hear a bit from you about how you plan to approach the BL collections, and as in your new position as curator, like, how do you work with people like Jenn and Paul, but under the BL roof? You know?
Yeah, so I'm actually approached it differently this time, and that's partly because I spent a lot of time poking around museum and library and archive collections, trying to make sense of them and trying to find the stories in the collections. And I'd previously poked around bits of the British Library data, and I think over time I've just built up the scars of battling incomplete metadata, things that have been, you know, these systems have had data entered into them over a couple of 100 years. So 12 spellings of Scotland, repeat that over every single possible value for every single field.
That's nothing, Paul.
And then, so I've actually approached it in terms of understanding the stories behind the collections. So partly the British Library, I think, is made up of 5 original institutions, and they all have different reasons for having collected the records or the collections. The collections themselves, and the area I work with, is everything from manuscripts to printed material to maps. The other day, I got lost and came across jukeboxes in a corridor. So there's all kinds of crazy things in the collections that you wouldn't necessarily expect a library to have. So I'm sort of finding out how other people have approached the collections, what they're interested in, what the curators who are looking after those really specific collections, what they're interested in, what they think is special about the collections. And because there's this really long history of digitisation in the library, which is still there's 150 million collection items. I'm still not really sure what that even means, because, you know, in some institutions I've worked in, every single pamphlet would be an item, but here they tend to be in bound volumes. So, you know, one item might contain 100 other items. So it's kind of fractals. And so finding out what people might be interested in sharing and what's available for reuse, and then finding people who want that and trying to connect other people to the collections, rather than me myself sort of saying, this is what I think is interesting. I'm trying to help create pipelines or connections between the collections and people who want to use them. And then I can sort of look over their shoulder as they're doing things. And I think that would, because you tend to sort of visualize things in the same way. So I think actually looking at how people are using them to think about the world, to think about research questions, is a more textured way of looking at these collections, because they're so varied. And it's when you've got 150 million items. I think perhaps 20% are digitized in some form. Without going deep, you risk smushing them all and sort of smearing the textures and not having a good sense of the individual parts of the collection. So I'm kind of taking a much more individualistic approach this time. But in many ways, people are they're at the point where they want to share collections. They want people to experience them. They want people to know they're here. So it's been a really positive experience. It doesn't mean I drink a lot of coffee chatting to people, but you know, the worst things happen.
Yeah, I love that point about texture and how, you know, a lot of the work that I've been doing is about exposing metadata systems pretty radically, you know, and the work we did with Jenn was about just showing all of the records and certainly respecting the metadata structures that were part of those records, like, you know, subject headings and so forth. But I guess my position there is that the individual using the system makes her own texture. You know, she finds it because she clicks on things she likes, and, you know, she generates a picture of the collection that her friend would never generate. And so, I mean, that feels kind of textural a bit, but it's lacking, I think, still, because there's not particularly an editorial point of view. And Jen, I know that's something you've been thinking about a bit, is sort of, are there ways we can use existing metadata structures to be editorial like that?
Yes, I've been thinking more about the catalog metadata as our first stab at editorial content, because as the in my former role as web editor, I was mostly involved just as we launched our master's digitization program in building 2 microsites. One was for our history of genetics archives called Code Breakers and Books, I should say, before Christy shouts at me, archives and books. And then I worked on London's Pulse, which was all about the London Medical Officer of Health reports. And it was very, I mean, I mentioned the scale of everything that was coming in before. And there is no way we can build a microsite for everything. And as soon as you start digitizing more Medical Officer of Health reports, it ceases to be London's Pulse. It's the Pulse of the UK. So what do? Do we have to change a microsite name? I don't think so. So part of the challenge for me of dealing with scale is actually thinking about how we can hook into interesting themes and topics and start to create some content around things that people are actually searching for, things that tie into exhibitions in Wellcome Collection, things that have more of a life than just, a board member wanting us to digitize our genetics content, things that have some popular appeal. But the fact is we can't do that for everything. We've got something like, was it 35,000 subject headings?
Something along those lines.
Something along those lines. 35,000 Library of Congress and medical subject headings. So we can't easily pick a theme and say we're going to spend the next 2 months as a tiny editorial team trying to create interesting interpretive content that can help people understand what this topic is about and why we have all this weird stuff. So I think the subject headings and being able to navigate and pivot around the collection in that way, in a more personalized way, kind of gets us around the fact that we can't actually staff a massive editorial project like that again. But it still means that we can't always put the Wellcome spin on things or tie our collections together in a way that helps. I'm going to say this phrase because it's in my head. Extend the brand. It doesn't. Where's tomatoes? Anyone? Yeah. So we are trying to do something on the website that I suppose is a bit more difficult, but we're trying to do it with the data now, with the prototype. So.
Yeah. It's kind of tricky, isn't it? Because, I mean, we've all admitted, well, I haven't admitted, but they have, sort of managing now these things that have been written about and talked about for hundreds of years, and yet we expect ourselves to, be able to broadcast and illustrate all the stories in these huge collections. And it's sort of a, Herculean task of grand proportions, and sort of, it's all. I see parallels in GDS's work now into the future, because you pick those sort of services that you knew everybody liked, let's say, or needed really a lot, but now there's hundreds left to go, aren't there? I mean,
most of our services aren't things that people love. Nobody likes doing this, but they're kind of good transactions. But we can make it as painless as possible. That's the goal. Yeah. But there's massive stories in all the data. Milan Registry, the past 20 years have been publishing the price paid for residential property, and it's a really good long CSV file, and there's loads of stories in there, but they just very few of them have the time to experiment with it. So I took some time and plotted a graph and showed it to them, and it's on their wall now, and I was really pleased that somebody printed it out and put it on the wall in the restaurant. But it was literally just on the y-axis, I had price paid per 5,000 increments, and then 20 years as a year across. and just made it sort of, based on the number of transactions, made it a darker colour. And you could see it's banding, and people were saying, what's the banding? Well, it's stamp duty. So, you know, if you pay, there's a threshold, if you pay more than, if your house is worth more than £250,000, suddenly the amount of stamp duty you pay when you buy a house goes up. So people obviously price their houses just below 250,000. And you can see where these things were introduced or taken off, and then you can see where it was announced because there'd be a stampede to meet the deadline. And just showing that to them, their own data, was, you know, brilliant. And then the other sort of side of things is people have hypotheses all the time around data. You know, like the Food Standards Agency, who I'm working with at the moment, have some brilliant data on ratings. You know, so local councils inspect restaurants and they give them a rating between 0 and 5, based on how likely. Well, yeah. You know, quite shocking actually, and we've stopped going to where we used to go for lunch. But anyway, but there's a hypothesis which, if you're failing your food standards, you're probably failing as a business. But then trying to work out how chains are related to, you know, to rest premises is really hard with the data's not linked together. But you know, there's lots of that. There's lots of people doing policy work based on presumptions without having data to back that hypothesis up. And the data's there, just needs joining up.
That's a really good point, I think, about institutional collections. At least from my point of view, there's something that the government must do with regards to sort of service provision that I think institutions aren't necessarily held to in the same kind of way. Like it's you know, I hear a lot from people, oh, this is just for researchers, you know, let's not worry about the great unwashed out there. It's only the researchers that we care about. And, you know, I actually think the opposite is true. And, you know, you need to be able to demonstrate use by all kinds of coloured, you know, different people, all colours of people. And I just wonder whether there's a step to be made towards that kind of service design that the GDS has sort of espoused for the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years in an institutional context. And again, let me come back to you, Mi. I mean, I know you're new in the job, but it's certainly a process of getting to know people. But that's sort of what service design is too. You know, you must speak to individuals and users of the system.
So one of the first things I did was ask where the audience research was, because that's just my background. It's like, what do you already know about how people want to use the collections? What do you know about the people in the reading rooms? What do they want to be doing in 5 years' time? And in a way, the library is trying to lead what scholars might be doing, because scholars, as far as I can tell, are often quite happy reading page by page. And they'll say, well, we want more digitised pages to read at home. That's great. And we're trying to say, well, maybe what might you be doing with collections at scale? So I've been thinking about demonstrators that might help people understand how digital technologies, like the things we've heard about today, relate to their scholarship and how they can make scholarly arguments that will pass a traditional history journal will say, okay, we understand enough of what you've done, we think it's reliable enough to publish alongside these painstakingly manually created tables of economic history data or whatever. Because until people are convinced that the results are reliable, they're less likely to use them. So that's part of understanding, you know, the user journey in that sort of classic sense. But I think it's also, I tend to go to dodgy food analogies when I'm talking about collections. So some people, they just want to go to Tesco's on the way home and pick up a pizza. Some people don't even want to do that. They want to call one of the many online services and just have pizza magically arrive at their house. And other people are like, I'm going to make my own dough, I'm going to find the perfect flour, I'm going to put a bit of polenta in there and mix it all up. And then I'm going to roast my veggies. So that, you know, some people just need to be fed in a hurry and they don't have time to think about anything else.
Right.
And other people really want to explore how things are made. And if you get someone who's really hungry and you're like, we've got some fantastic flour in for you, and we've grown these veggies in the garden, so if you go and roast those and maybe marinate some things, then you can have a great pizza. And they're like, I'm just going to call Hungry House. So you have to understand that it's not to me, it's not about putting people into categories, but letting people categorize themselves and saying, this is the kind of experience I want to have. And then you can say, these collections are pure mucky metadata with pages and pages of untranscribed text. It's just slabs of pages of book images. But these are the treasures of our collection. These are the manuscripts. And this is how you understand what was in these manuscripts and what they meant to people at the time and the stories they contain. So I think sometimes when you make that decision for people, I don't think that's right. It's a bit patronizing, but when you say, we understand that you're busy and maybe right now all you want is ready-made pizza, then here you go.
So you're equating ready-made pizza to the jewels of the collection, as it were?
To the interpretation. No. Because it's not the objects, it's the information around them. So any one object could have, I mean, I've worked in museums where 800 records, swiftly moving on, have, it'll be a beautiful, beautiful object, but all it will say in the catalogue is pot, because the collections order is still somewhere down the far end of the storeroom and hasn't made it up to this gorgeous pot yet.
Yeah.
So it's about the information that you have, which comes back to resources and comes back to decisions that people made about what to record when they accessioned an object or when they received this donation of personal papers from someone's archive, as well as the resources they've had since then. But it's a kind of mosaic of, as far as I can tell within the library, it's just like all these different little collections that have been added to and enhanced in different ways over time. So you can't even necessarily point people to, this is going to suit your experience, this is going to suit what you want. It's a negotiation between what's in the collections, what's available about the collections, and what people want to do at any given time.
Yeah, I think we're just at the very beginning of digital experiences of massive 100-year-old collections, and it's my opinion that the sort of technology and interfaces that we built even over the last sort of 30 or 40 years revolve or are centred on search as the primary interrogation method for things, and that doesn't even touch the sorts of experiences that you describe where you roast your own vegetables, as it were. And to me, it just feels like the very beginning of trying to understand that sort of spectrum of different experiences and make them available to people online, and I think that's hugely exciting. But, as I started with, I think it definitely comes back to what your metadata is like and how accessible that is. And I think there's also an interesting thread that runs along David's lecture from this morning about sort of social machines and, wondering about how institutions can recognise in an online context what people are looking at and how they're consuming things, and seeing if there's a way to sort of begin to fold that back into the work that they're doing in terms of classification and accessibility and that sort of thing. I'm conscious of time, but I'm hoping for some conversation with all of you. So if there's questions, please, I think it's time. Yes?
Yeah, so if you think about the space of your collection and the things that you're going to invest as an institution in putting out there, it strikes me that to start with the land registry or the 25 projects that you've identified, or the example that Jenn gave from Wellcome, really we're starting in the wrong place. Because if we essentially set our stall out saying, if I just made the land registry data available in a dirty format, there would be a commercial market for that. There would be Rightmove, mouse prices. People would come and do it. If I made the treasures of Cambridge University Library available just as raw metadata and loose files, people would go away and look at it. But it's the hidden value. It's the hidden bits of the collection. That's what some people call the long tail, and how we ever pull that bit out. Because generally, most cultural heritage institutions do start with their treasures. They start with these low-hanging fruit because someone's more than likely willing to pay to have it done. But then we do a great injustice, I think, to the rest of it. And what's our role to find not the top 25 things that government should be doing, but the really obscure things.
So I should say the 25 things were picked by government in general, but
Not Paul, not you yourself?
no, and actually there were it was like, what's on my agenda, as in, minister sort of thing, and some of it's based on, what's the user need, as in, land registry. A lot of people move house. It's one of the most painful experiences you can have, after divorce and bereavement. So it's quite a good thing to attack. I mean, it wasn't attacked because it was I like the idea about it being a little hanging fruit. It didn't feel like it when I was working there. Yes, yeah. So I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, how you want to get everything out there, but that's...
But I think it's who gets everything out there. And I think at the moment, we're putting out the things that are obvious that everyone wants, because that's our mission.
So I should say that some of this data is... So one of the things we are sort of evolving as a principle is to separate what's, private and what's open, and make things open. And the moment we've got this kind of wishy-washy world where things are like conflated together and kept in a sort of pseudo-privacy, and that causes all sorts of problems. I mean, obviously, talk in the press at the moment, there's lots of things where you can unpick people's lives with not much information. So we have to be really careful about that. And we also have a massive challenge in the UK. We don't have an identity card. So there's a list of owners of property, and there's a list of keepers of vehicles and a list of drivers. Those are separate things. So a lot of these things are sort of hard to deal with. I think there's 20,000 data sets on data.gov, but I think everybody would agree it's 20,000 things. We want sort of more loved things to be out. So fewer, more loved things is what we're working on now.
Just a quick comment before we move to the next question. I just wanted to say that some of the research I've been doing into sort of these interfaces to expose the long tail, I actually called spelunker, which is an American word for cave diving. It's sort of a bit moist and really dark, and you might die, if you go into this weird corner. And this is an idea that I don't know what people want to look for, and you just have to sort of relinquish control over telling them what they should look at, and let them find those dark corners. But the trick is, I think, to recognise if they do, and try to see that coming back into the database in some way. Any other questions? I had sorry. There's yes, in the glasses up there. There's a mic coming.
I wanted to ask about sustainability, and partly in the context of open. Because if I go and talk to the HLF about why they fund projects where the outputs are not open, they would say, well, it's not sustainable to fund digitisation, if the outputs are going to be open. And you think, okay. But at the same time, we are all aware, I think, perhaps of projects that have been funded, that if you said to them, and where's your project going to be, your online project in 10 years' time, they would make a noise that would be a bit like, I don't know. So I wonder, between those two things, where does sustainability then starts to seem like a slightly elusive? We can feel like we know what we'd like, but between those two things, it's kind of a messy place. People making bad choices.
Anyone?
I suppose from the Wellcome perspective, I've talked mostly about what we're doing on our own website, but we try to release all of our content with as liberal licenses as we can get away with, and our hope is that people will put things on Wikimedia. If people take our stuff and put it elsewhere, that we might achieve some sustainability there. If Wellcome Library shut down tomorrow, our content still lives on the UK Medical Heritage Library, on Internet Archive, on Wikipedia. So I suppose I don't know if that's the type of sustainability you were looking for, but those are just objects living in a different place. They're not tied to any intellectual output. They've got metadata attached, but they're not part of someone's research, I suppose, unless
it's a mixed picture, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we would probably say that the Wellcome are the good guys, if good guys there are. But even there, if you take something like Codebreakers, you can see those assets are going to be around in the long term. But I don't know, maybe it's more difficult to work out where that curatorial stuff sits, and we're not in a place where we can say, here's some metadata written about an interesting object 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. We're not there yet.
I will say, I think, one more question. Having sustainability of the data and the project be a part of a funding requirement, I think, is fantastic. And I'd encourage everybody just to have that in the back. I mean, you do because you work in libraries and museums, but you know, in terms of software, that's really difficult to account for sometimes. So thinking that through and making lots of copies as one strategy is you know, something to keep in mind. That's a good question, thank you. And our last question, make it good.
I'll try. Conrad Taylor. It's a sort of messy question, but you've got to kind of throw, if you're going to make some sort of splash in the pond, you've got to get a small enough stone and throw it into a particular place. So as a case, I'm thinking of cracking open various kinds of media that are difficult to give internal access to. And I thought maybe I'd throw the stone in the direction of Mia. I'm thinking of audio files, particularly those which are documentary or explanatory. It could be oral history, or there's an excellent series on the World Service at the moment that's about elements and their periodic table elements and their role in business. So the trouble is a program can cover a lot of different subjects, and what actually, when it comes to think of it, it's not unique to audio. People don't necessarily want the container. They want the bit of information. They want to know, why is dysprosium important in wind power generation, which is not going to be the title of it's not going to be the title of the program. The role of tin in float glass production, which I didn't know about until I heard. So how does one deal with that kind of multifarious amount of knowledge that's in a quite difficult media and format to crack open and document? Mia, do you want to have a go?
I'll have a go. I mean, I should say that there are probably people here working with sound archives in the British Library who could give you a better answer. But one of the things that I think institutions need to grapple with is becoming more porous. So they might have someone depositing a file that's an hour of the Today program or something, and you only want to know about 5 minutes of that program. The BBC World Archive has been doing a lot of work with having sort of machine tagging of topics and voices in archives that they then give to people to sort of manually verify.
That's the BL Lab stuff.
No, that's the BBC World Service stuff. So there are people looking at it, but it also puts a lot of pressure on collection systems, to particularly ones that have, coming from a museum background, I've been fascinated with the archive and library systems here. Finding aids are really different to museum catalogues. They're very much, if you look in this box, you will find correspondence discussing this topic. If you're lucky, it'll say that. Otherwise, it might be, this is from blah, and you have to look at the topics yourself. Where museums tend to catalogue down to the item level. So finding ways of cataloguing to the item level, to the minute level in institutions that traditionally think about blobs of content is a really tricky thing. And for big institutions that specify their systems 5 years before they're available to the public, it's really tricky because the needs change all the time. Our expectations change as users because we see what Google does, what Facebook does. So there are solutions, and hopefully opening up data to let other people make systems is one way of at least providing some access to those things while the larger institution is catching up. That's obviously not an official answer, so talk to someone who's a bit more used to the BL about what they might think about that.
Okay, so thank you. We need to wrap up now, but if there's one thing that I took away from today, it's that we're starting to appreciate the dynamic of human and machine working together to do things. And as Mario said, you know, our operations are sort of becoming semi-automatic, where we're remembering that we need to keep the humans involved and we can't just have computers do everything. So on that happy note, thank you to my panelists for coming, and let's have a drink, shall we?